She returned home never knowing that the man she hated most in the world would be the only one capable of standing by her side when everything crumbled around her, and that she, without realizing it, would do exactly the same for him. Have you ever felt that kind of hatred that simply refuses to fade? The kind you carry inside like a hard stone, present every time the person's name is mentioned, every time you turn a corner and see their face. Now imagine that all this hatred, every ounce you fed for years on end, was built upon a wound the other person does not even remember causing. Imagine discovering this after so much time. Imagine what to do with everything that has been accumulating. It is something that hurts and liberates at the same time, like pulling out a deep thorn that was lodged so far inside you had forgotten where it ended and where you began. This story took place in March of 1931, in the heart of North Carolina, in a region of green rolling hills, red clay dust, and apple orchards that spread up the mountainside like a quilt embroidered by patient hands. The place was called St. Jude's Ridge, a small and proud village where everyone knew everyone else's history, where feuds between families lasted decades and were passed down from father to son like an heirloom, and where marriages were the talk of the entire street before the young man even bent his knee. If you are here, let us start from the very beginning, for this story deserves to be told with care. And before continuing, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? It could be from the South, the Midwest, the East Coast, the West, anywhere in the country or even abroad. We want to know where this story reached you. Write it down below, because we read every single comment, and we love knowing where each person who is here with us comes from. Marianne Cordell was 26 years old when she stepped off the train at the Catawba station with a battered leather suitcase, a grey linen dress she had sewn herself in Raleigh, and a determination that, if it could be weighed, would be heavier than the luggage. She was a woman of simple appearance at first glance. Dark hair pinned up with a tortoiseshell comb, a clean face without adornment, eyes the colour of dark roast coffee, which had the inconvenient habit of looking as if they saw more than they should. Those who knew her understood that this simplicity was deceptive. Marianne Cordell possessed a kind of inner clarity that few achieve without suffering, the sort that only appears in those who have learned to function without support and discovered they functioned quite well that way. She had left for Raleigh 5 years earlier. She had gone with her father's blessing, with the address of a cousin who could host her, and with a talent for sewing that no one in the family took quite as seriously as she did. The city had welcomed her with the characteristic indifference that big cities reserve for those arriving from the countryside, as if to say you may try, but do not expect it to be easy. Marianne had answered that indifference with the only method she knew, constant work, without complaining and without asking for any discounts. Within 2 years, she was the most sought-after seamstress in the shop where she worked, on a busy downtown street where high society ladies went for their party gowns and Sunday luncheon dresses. In her 3rd year, she pooled her savings with the help of a partner named Connie, a practical and cheerful woman who balanced Marianne's seriousness with an easy conversational charm that drew in clientele. They opened a small dressmaking studio in a 2-room space with a window facing the street. It was small, but it was theirs. Marianne sewed until the daylight faded and then sewed by the glow of an oil lamp. She did this for 2 more years without a single complaint, because the progress she saw was real, and she knew how to distinguish effort that matters from effort that leads nowhere. In her 5th year, the letter from her father arrived. Joseph Cordell was a man of words when he wanted to be, but that letter was short, strangely short for someone who liked to fill the page. It said the orchard was going through difficult times, that the apple harvest had been poor for 2 consecutive years, that there was a debt with the bank that needed attention. And then, almost in passing, as if it were a minor detail in a larger inventory, it mentioned he was not feeling very well. That it was nothing serious, probably, but he felt she ought to know. Marianne read the letter 3 times. She knew her father well enough to understand what was written in the margins of what he had left unsaid. Joseph Cordell was the type to downplay his pain. The milder the letter, the graver the situation. She went. She left the studio in Connie's hands with a signed document and the promise to return soon. She did not yet know that soon was a word that time was about to redefine. She arrived in St. Jude's Ridge on a warm afternoon in October of 1930 to find her father much thinner than he had been in her memory, with eyes set deeper and hands trembling more than they should have been. The farm, Good Hope, was in a situation the letter had failed to adequately measure. The debts were larger than anticipated. The apple orchards needed pruning and supplies there was no money to buy, and the creek that served for irrigation and domestic use was thinner than it ought to be, a reflection of 2 years of below-average rainfall in a region that depended on its waters for absolutely everything. Marianne stayed. She reorganized the accounts with the clarity she had learned in the city. She spoke with the bank, negotiated deadlines, and sold what could be sold without compromising the essentials. She cared for her father with that practical, unexaggerated care that was her way of loving, without spilling over with sentiments that might get in the way, yet without letting him lack anything he needed. And in February of 1931, on a Saturday morning that began just like any other, Joseph Cordell sat in the rocking chair on the porch with a cup of coffee, turned his eyes to the orchards on the hill, and grew quiet in a way that no quiet can ever be fixed. The cup went cold in his lap. Marianne found him like that when she went to call him for lunch, still in the chair, wearing the expression of someone who had finally reached where they were heading. She inherited the farm, the debts, and a loneliness that was entirely different from any other she had experienced before. There were no other close heirs. Her mother, Letitia, had passed away when Marianne was still too small to keep more than fragments of memories, taken by a fever that did not choose its victims. Her older brothers had left one by one over the years, each with their own reasons and destinations, none returning when the troubles began. Marianne harbored no resentment over this. She simply held the fact with the objective precision she maintained for things she could not change. Good Hope consisted of 100 acres of fertile red clay, with a main house of clapboard and a shingled roof, a barn, a chicken coop, and the apple orchards that descended the hill in rows that urgently needed attention. The creek that cut through the eastern border of the property, locally known as Briar Creek because of the thickets that grew along its banks, had diminished to an alarming degree. In good years, it was generous. In that March of 1931, it held only a fraction of what it should, but there was a problem far greater than the drought, the orchards, and the debts combined, and this problem was named Richard Sutton. Marianne spotted the horse first, a large, dark animal tied to the post at the entrance of the property, with the confidence of someone who believes they have the right to be anywhere. She stepped down from the wagon with her suitcase in hand before the driver had even come to a complete stop, and started walking toward the entrance with that stride people in St. Jude's Ridge recognized from afar. Shoulders straight, chin lifted, footsteps that asked permission for absolutely nothing. Richard Sutton was leaning against the wooden fence beside the gate, arms crossed and his leather hat tilted to shield him from the midday sun. He was 29 years old. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face marked by the sun and the wind, bearing the appearance of someone who had spent his entire life between hard work and rough weather, without ever complaining about either. He had thick hands that contrasted with a way of speaking which, when he wanted, came out organized and precise, like someone who thought before opening his mouth. When he did not want to, it came out direct and without detours, something many people confused with rudeness, but which was, in truth, simply an absence of ornament. He tipped his hat upon seeing her. The gesture came more from habit than ceremony, that reflex men raised with a certain kind of upbringing carry without needing to think. Marianne stopped 6 feet away. They stood looking at each other for a moment without saying anything. She felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the one that only appeared when the Sutton name entered the conversation, or when memory decided to present the bill without warning. Richard was the first to speak. He said he knew she had arrived and that he had come over because he wanted to talk before things took a more complicated turn. His voice came out firm, without direct aggressiveness, but also without that softness people use when they want to please someone. Marianne replied that she had arrived less than a day ago, had buried her father less than a month ago, and did not recall inviting anyone to show up at the gate of her property. She said this with the calm and controlled voice she used when she was at her angriest, that tone which neither rose nor fell because it did not need to do either to reach its mark. Richard did not move. He said he understood her timing and respected it, but that there was an issue regarding the water that needed to be addressed soon, because the drought was worsening and both properties were suffering the consequences in equally serious ways. She stared at him for a second that lasted much longer on the inside than it appeared on the outside. There was something in the way he had said it, without flourish and without condescension, that she registered before she could defend herself against noticing. Then she stated she would hear what he had to say, but that it would not be at this exact moment, because she had just arrived and had things to do, and that she would send word when she was ready to talk. She turned her back before he could reply, grabbed her suitcase and walked onto the property as if that were the end of the conversation. She left him with the words in his mouth and his hat in his hand, and she did not look back. It was not the end of the conversation. She knew it was not, but it was the only beginning she could manage to offer for today. The rivalry between the Cordell and Sutton families had roots over 20 years deep, and it was so well established in St. Jude's Ridge that the village folks no longer even needed to know the details to know it existed. It had become part of the landscape, like the hill behind the church and the bell that rang at 6 in the morning. Its origin lay in a business deal that had gone sour back when Thomas Sutton, Richard's grandfather, and Joseph Cordell, Marianne's father, were informal partners in the processed apple trade. In 1908, an agreement to purchase a harvest lot had been made by word of mouth, as was the custom in a time when a man's word was worth more than signed paper, or so it was believed. When the payment deadline arrived, the money did not. When Joseph collected, Thomas presented a different version of the agreement, with different numbers and different conditions. There was no document to say who was right. There were only two versions and two prides that could not fit in the same room. The fight was public and ugly, as fights over money between acquaintances always are, carrying that extra quality of bitterness that only happens when it involves someone you once trusted. The families stopped speaking. They stopped greeting each other at church service. They began to make that specific effort known only to those who live in small towns, pretending the other person does not exist when both are in the exact same space, without ever ceasing to be, in truth, completely aware of each other. Richard had grown up hearing the Suttons' version, which was the version where Joseph Cordell had gotten the numbers confused, and then, out of pride, refused to admit it. Marianne had grown up hearing the Cordells, which was the version where Thomas Sutton had changed the terms when it became convenient. Each side carried their own with the absolute certainty that only comes when you hear a story told the exact same way for so long that it feels like memory. But there was something more between them than the inheritance of a family feud. Something only Marianne carried, because only she remembered it. And it was, perhaps, the most painful point of all, the burden of carrying a wound all alone, without the other even knowing he had caused it. It was at a summer jubilee in 1924, July. Marianne was 19 and back in St. Jude's Ridge on a holiday visit. Those short weeks she used to see her father and smell the earth that still pulled at her even when the city started making sense. The festival was on the church green, like every year, with the colourful bunting the Reverend had ordered hung since the week before, the scent of warm cider and peach cobbler mingling in the hot night air, the square dances enlivened by the blind fiddler who played by heart and with absolute beauty. Richard was 22 that summer. He was the son of the most influential farmer in the region, and he knew it with that involuntary awareness that people raised with privilege develop without realizing it. He had a group of friends who were all variations of the same type. Young men from good families, accustomed to being the most important people in whatever room they entered, sharing that specific brand of humor that laughs at things at the expense of those who cannot fight back. Marianne did not learn of the wager right away. She found out later from the mouth of a cousin who had overheard it by accident and relayed it with that mixture of pity and astonishment that makes the whole thing hurt even more. The bet had been between Richard and Nelson Fields, his closest friend since childhood, a young man with an easy laugh and very little judgment. It was simple and cruel in its simplicity. Richard had bet he could dance 2 square dances with Marianne Cordell, the daughter of their rivals, without her realizing who he was until the second dance ended. The idea behind it was to see if the Cordell girl, whom folks claimed was fierce and closed off, would soften up like any other when a good-looking young man approached her properly. Richard had come up to her that night with a posture different from his usual one. Less arrogance on the surface, more attention in his eyes. He had asked her to dance with that blend of simplicity and confidence that works when it is genuine, and which had worked even though it was not. Marianne had found the gentleness strange, because any sudden approaching was cause for suspicion, but she had let it happen. There was something in the way he looked at her in that moment that did not seem calculated, that felt real, and she, who was by no means naive, had let that perception weigh more than it should have. They danced the 2 square dances. He was good at it, which was unexpected and entirely inconvenient. They spoke little between the songs, but enough for her to feel the beginnings of that diffuse interest, which lacks a name when you are young and is so easily confused with almost anything else. And then, when the second dance finished, his group of friends arrived laughing, Nelson leading the pack, and the announcement was made out loud. The bet, the details, the amount wagered. Words that the entire vicinity of the festival heard, some people laughing, others looking away, with that discomfort of those who do not wish to witness something but do not know how to leave. Marianne had stood frozen with the heat of the dance still on her face. She felt the solid, packed earth beneath her feet as something entirely necessary. Then she turned her back and walked away from the festival with her head held high, exactly the way she walked in any other situation, without running, without showing a single thing. She returned to her father's house. She did not cry that night. She never cried in front of anyone over this. Richard had tried to go after her later that same night, had called her name once in the dark of the street, but she did not stop. And then, when she returned to Raleigh a few days later, there was no longer any opportunity. The years passed. She worked. She grew. She built something of her own with her very own hands. And she managed not to think about him for so long that she genuinely came to believe she had left it all behind. She had not left it behind. She had merely stored it away. Now he was at the gate of her property, with that same way of existing in a space as if the space naturally belonged to him, and Marianne felt all those years of distance collapse in a fraction of a second. It was not a sharp pain. It was that dull ache old grievances have of showing up unannounced when least expected. She needed to solve the farm's problem. She needed the water from Briar Creek. And the only path to that water ran straight through the conversation she had just postponed. The main house of Good Hope smelled of frozen time on that first night. It was that specific scent rooms acquire when the person who inhabited them departs, as if the very air went into mourning, a combination of old wood and leather and something softer. She only recognized a moment later as the smell of the coffee her father drank every single morning. Marianne walked through the rooms with that blend of sorrow and inventory one employs when needing to understand exactly what one has inherited. The plastered walls were solid. The wooden floorboards creaked in two specific spots, but held up well. The kitchen had the usual utensils, the cast-iron pots her mother had left behind, and which her father had kept with the care dedicated to things that hold more value than their material. The bedroom that had been hers in childhood still had the iron bed with the straw mattress, the wooden trunk in the corner, and on the wall a nail, where she had hung a small mirror that remained there, now reflecting a woman quite different from the girl who had left. She opened the trunk. Beneath a carefully folded sheet lay a wooden box containing all the letters she had sent her father over the course of 5 years. He had kept every single one. Marianne stared at the box for a while without opening it, her hand resting flat on the lid, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. And then she closed the trunk, walked out to the porch, and stood watching the apple orchards until the night completely closed in. The afternoon had turned into one of those country nights the city can never quite imitate, truly dark, thick with stars, and holding a silence that is only silence to those who do not know how to listen. Because to those who know, it is filled with crickets, the wind rustling through the orchard leaves, and the distant hooting of an owl marking its territory. Marianne sat there until exhaustion grew heavier than her thoughts, and then she went to sleep in a bed that smelled purely of the past. The dawn of the following day arrived with that March crispness in the Carolina hills, smelling of wet earth and meadow grass, and something much older that lacks an exact name. Marianne woke before the sun, which had been her habit since childhood, and which the city had tried unsuccessfully to correct. She lay there for a few minutes listening to the silence of the house gradually gain sounds, the wind at the window, a distant bird rehearsing the day outside, the creak of the floorboards in some spot where the timber breathed with the changing temperature. She got up. She brewed coffee in the Good Hope kitchen, which was cold from the early hours, but warmed quickly once the fire in the wood stove caught. She drank it standing up, looking out the backyard window that was still dark, the canopy of the old oak tree casting a massive shadow against the sky that was beginning to lighten in the east, in shades of grey and pink, slowly being replaced by the yellow light of morning. Then she went to the room where her father had kept the farm's documents. Joseph Cordell was organized in his own peculiar way, which was not Marianne's way, but which possessed its own logic once you understood the code. The ledgers were in a wooden crate leaning against the wall. The deeds and legal papers were in a leather folder hanging from a nail behind the door. The correspondence was stacked by date in a desk drawer, bound with a beige string faded from heavy use. Marianne spent the entire morning reading. She read the account books of the last 4 years, line by line, with the sharp attention she had developed at the studio for financial controls that forgave no carelessness. She read the correspondence with the bank, the letters from creditors drafted in that formal language that attempted to be cordial and managed to be threatening all the same. She read the receipts for supply purchases, the sales records for the apples, the contracts with the seasonal workers from the last harvest. What she found was simultaneously worse and better than she had expected. Worse because the debt was larger than her father had indicated in the letter, the result of 2 bad harvests, coupled with a financing decision that had seemed reasonable at the time and had become costly when the market price for apples fell lower than any forecast. Better because, looking at the numbers with the clarity she brought to them, there was a path forward, narrow, demanding, completely dependent on a harvest that required water which currently was not there. But it existed. The water problem was the knot tying it all together, and the knot bore the name Richard Sutton, which made everything far more complicated than it would be if it were merely a matter of plumbing and dams. Marianne closed the final ledger. She stacked everything back in the order she had found it, placed it in the crate, and hung the leather folder back on its nail. She sat for a moment in her father's chair, hands resting on the dark wooden desk that held decades of decisions made right there, and looked out the window at the orchards becoming fully visible as the morning sun advanced over the hill. There was work to be done, and she knew how to work. That was enough to begin. The following morning, before the sun was high, Mrs. Pearl Anderson appeared. 70 years of life, all of them spent in St. Jude's Ridge or its outskirts. Mrs. Pearl was short, round, with white hair pinned back in a bun that resisted the heat, the wind, and time with the exact same firmness she did. She had small, lively eyes, the color of dark honey, carrying that specific expression of someone who has seen a great deal and learned to be surprised by almost nothing, but who still thoroughly enjoys observing. She arrived early with a pot of bean stew draped over her arm, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to show up at someone's house at 7 in the morning on a Monday. She stated she had been a dear friend of the late Letitia Cordell, and therefore considered herself well within her rights to drop by unannounced. She added that she knew Marianne probably had not eaten a proper meal since she arrived, and that she was not leaving without leaving the stew she had cooked. Marianne laughed. It was the first laugh since returning to St. Jude's Ridge, and it came out a bit rusty from so much time out of use, but it was entirely real. The two women sat on the porch with their bowls of hot stew, and Mrs. Pearl spoke of the village with the fluency of someone who knows every stone by heart, shifting from one subject to another as if they were all connected by an invisible thread only she could see. She talked about who had arrived and who had left, about the new reverend who had replaced Reverend Bennett, about the harvest being difficult for everyone due to the drought. And then, with the naturalness of someone threading a needle with precise aim, she mentioned she had seen Richard Sutton's horse tied at the entrance of Good Hope the previous day. Marianne replied with deliberate care that he had come by to discuss the matter of the creek. Mrs. Pearl nodded slowly, stirring her stew with a spoon she had pulled from her apron pocket, as if an apron were the most natural place to store silverware. She said the creek issue was growing serious for both sides, that the drought of 1931 was shaping up to be the harshest in 15 years, that all the farmers in the region were worried about water, but that the situation for Good Hope and Fairview was uniquely delicate because both properties depended on the exact same source of Briar Creek. Marianne asked what Mrs. Pearl thought she ought to do. The old woman looked at her over the rim of the bowl with those honey eyes that saw much more than they should. She answered that she thought Marianne should listen to what the young man had to say, not because the Suttons were saints, because they were not, and she had no need to pretend they were, but because water holds no loyalties. A drought does not wait for families to finish their ancient feuds before watering the orchards. Marianne remained silent for a moment. Then she said she would think about it. Mrs. Pearl replied that this was fine, but that she ought to think fast, because the sun was not a patient creature. It was 3 days before Marianne sent word to the Fairview orchard. 3 days she used to walk the entire property inch by inch, registering what was in good condition and what needed absolute attention. To visit the bank in Catawba and sit down with the manager, a man with thin glasses and a careful vocabulary, and to grasp the real numbers of the debt without any rounding in her favor, and to write, on the night of the 3rd day, one of the letters that would never be sent. It was a habit she had started at age 20, on a night when the longing for her mother became too heavy and she had no one to talk to without it costing something. To grab the paper, take the pen, and write as if Letitia Cordell could read it. She knew it was only paper. But there was something in the act of writing that organized the confusion inside, that separated what truly mattered from what was just making noise. That night she wrote about the state of the farm, about the debt that was manageable if there was a good harvest, about the smell of the house that still held her father in its very walls. She wrote about the orchards that needed care, which she was learning to provide even as she went. And at the end, almost like a footnote, she wrote that Richard Sutton had appeared at the property entrance and that she had been so tense she could barely manage to be polite. Then she paused. She looked at what she had written. And she added in slightly smaller handwriting, like someone who does not wish to openly acknowledge what she is saying, that he looked different from what she remembered. Not different in the sense of improved, that was not it, but different. More serious, less of that arrogant youth from the Jubilee, as if the years had worked on him too, the way they work on everyone who is truly living. She folded the letter, placed it in the trunk with the others, and went to sleep with more things occupying her mind than she should have had. The message she sent to Fairview was simple. It stated she would be available to discuss Briar Creek on Thursday morning on the porch of Good Hope, that he should arrive before 9 because she had work to do. Richard showed up at 8:45. Alone, without his hat this time, carrying a leather folder under his arm that contained documents. He was organized, which was a new and somehow inconvenient piece of information for Marianne, who had spent years building the image of Edward Sutton and his kin as people who operated more through shouting and power than through logic and paperwork. They sat on the porch. Marianne had brewed coffee, because failing to prepare it would have been a lack of manners she was unwilling to commit, regardless of any other consideration. Richard thanked her with a brevity that was genuine, not performative. He opened the folder and placed 2 documents on the table between them. One was a map of the region, with the boundary line between the 2 properties marked in pencil. The other was a flow survey of the Briar Creek source, conducted by an agronomist from Catawba 2 months earlier, back when the drought had first become visible in the numbers rather than just to the eyes. He explained without beating around the bush. The spring was producing 1/3 of the volume it had produced 5 years ago. At the current rate of decline, in 2 months the water would not be enough to sustain even one of the 2 properties. And he had a proposal to present. Marianne looked at the documents with close attention. She had a good head for numbers, having honed that skill in the city, and the numbers in that survey were severe. She asked him to explain the proposal. The proposal was to build a shared capture and distribution system, a small damming of the spring that would hold the volume instead of letting it run off, featuring 2 outlets regulated by wooden sluice gates, one for each farm, with a flow proportional to the size of the properties. The construction costs would be split between the 2. The management would be joint, with monthly meetings to adjust the gates according to each side's needs and the available volume. There was a pause when he finished explaining, the kind of pause that occurs when a proposal makes perfect sense and the person listening does not want to admit it easily. Marianne asked who had done the construction calculations. Richard replied that the same agronomist had done an initial estimate, reviewed by a hydraulic engineer from Raleigh, whom he had consulted by letter. She stared at the map for a moment. Then she raised her eyes to him and asked, using the measured voice she adopted when testing the waters, why he had consulted someone from Raleigh without first speaking to her, since the proposal involved both sides. Richard answered that he had consulted them to have solid numbers before proposing, not to decide without her. He said a proposal without a concrete basis is just idle talk, and he had not come over to talk, he had come to solve the issue. She kept her eyes on him for a second longer than she intended. There was something in that way of speaking, in that precision devoid of ornament, that she recognized. It was the manner of someone who had learned that stalling carries a price, that lost time does not return. She recognized it because she possessed the exact same trait. This did not pry her open, but it did create a sliver of a crack. She stated she needed 3 days to review the documents calmly and prepare her own questions before giving any answer, that if the numbers made sense, they would discuss the practical details. Richard said 3 days was fine. He closed the folder, rose from his chair, then he paused before stepping down from the porch. He did not turn completely toward her. remaining in profile, and said in a voice a pitch lower that he was deeply sorry for the passing of her father. That Joseph Cordell had been a man of honest toil, and that this deserved to be acknowledged independently of whatever else stood between the two families. Marianne did not reply immediately. She felt that tightening in her chest that certain unexpected kindnesses cause when one's guard is up, that sensation of something wanting to loosen that a person holds back because they do not know if it is safe. Then she said thank you in a quiet voice. He nodded, descended the steps, went to his horse and rode off down the red dirt road without looking back. Marianne remained on the porch with her hands wrapped around the coffee cup that had gone cold without her noticing, watching the trail of dust the animal left in the morning air. She stood there until the dust settled. Then she went inside and stared at the documents scattered across the porch table for a long time before beginning to read them. The documents were solid. That was precisely what irritated her. The 3 days that followed were days of hard work. Marianne visited the Briar Creek property line alone for the first time, walking the eastern boundary, observing the creek with eyes that were still learning to read water and earth, but which learned quickly. She spoke with Gideon, the Good Hope foreman who had stayed on during the boss's illness, with the quiet loyalty of someone who needs no praise to do what is right. Gideon was 50 years old, with a thick mustache and a knowledge of the land that was not the kind found in any book. Gideon told her with all the objectivity he possessed that the spring was in bad shape, that damming it was the only way out he could see, and that doing it alone, without the cooperation of the other side of the boundary, would be more expensive, more complicated, and likely less efficient than doing it together. She listened. She weighed it. And on the night of the 3rd day, with the documents on the table in front of her and the oil lamp casting shadows on the walls, Marianne Cordell made the decision that cost her, but which clarity rendered inevitable. She was going to accept the proposal, not because she had decided to like Richard Sutton, not because she had decided to trust the Suttons, but because the farm needed water, and the water required a solution she could not construct alone. And because maintaining a grudge in the space where strategy belonged was a luxury she could not afford at the moment. She sent word the following day. What neither of them knew was that this practical decision, this convergence of necessities, would be the first stone of something neither had planned and which neither would be able to halt once it was set in motion. Construction of the dam began in early April, when the month still brought a hint of moisture in the dawn air before the midday sun burned away everything the night had given. Richard had hired 3 men experienced in waterworks, hailing from Catawba, and Gideon was placed in charge of coordinating the labor on the Good Hope side. The chosen site for the damming lay precisely on the boundary line, at a bend in Briar Creek where the stream naturally widened, forming a small depression with solid clay banks on 3 sides. Marianne supervised the beginning of the works from a deliberate distance. She stayed back, observing the progress, asking the questions she needed to ask Gideon without having to approach the Sutton side of the operation any more than strictly necessary. Richard did the same from the opposite side, a symmetry neither of them had agreed upon, but which both executed with the precision of people who know exactly what they are doing. It was Gideon who put an end to this on the 3rd morning of construction. The foreman went to find Marianne at the main house, with that direct manner which was his trademark, slapped his hat against his thigh once, and stated there was a technical issue regarding the placement of one of the sluice gates that needed to be decided by both owners together because it affected both sides differently depending on the chosen solution. He added that the men were waiting and that waiting cost money both of them were paying. Marianne walked down to the creek. Richard was already there, crouching at the edge of the site, staring at the spot for the gate with that concentration of someone measuring before deciding. He stood up when he heard her approaching. He offered no greeting. He simply pointed to the spot in question and explained the problem in clean technical terms. The eastern gate, if installed in its original position, would work fine for Good Hope, but would create a zone of stagnant water that in the summer heat could cause quality issues. There was an alternative position that solved this, but it slightly altered the division of the flow. Marianne looked. She thought. Then she asked exactly how much the flow would be affected and if there were calculations. Richard opened the folder he carried and showed the math. It was a minor figure, well within the margin of tolerance their agreement had established. She analyzed it, confirmed it in her head, and stated that the alternative position made sense. They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the rough framing of the gate, with the sound of the thin creak in the background and the morning heat rising from the mud. It was the first time they were genuinely side by side, without either of them adopting an immediate defensive posture. One of the hired men, knowing absolutely nothing of their shared history, asked a technical question addressed to both of them simultaneously, as if they were merely the boss and the lady of an ordinary work site. Richard answered one part. Marianne completed the other. The man nodded and went back to work. The two of them realized what had occurred a little while later, when they were each already heading back to their own sides. Marianne did not know what name to give to that. So she did not name it. She went to work. The month of April was filled with construction and a gradual approach that she tried her best not to notice and ended up noticing anyway. Building the dam required both of them to be present for the major decisions, which were frequent enough that the deliberate distance she had established became increasingly inconvenient for the progress of the work. There was a wooden bench the workers had placed in the shade of an old sycamore tree by the creek, and that was where the practical discussions took place whenever they needed to happen. Marianne always arrived punctually. Richard did the same. They sat with a respectful amount of space between them, documents spread on the table, and tackled the matter with the efficiency of two professionals who prefer to get straight to the point. It was during one of these meetings, on a mid-April afternoon, with the scent of fresh mud hanging in the air, that the first true moment occurred. Marianne had said something regarding the reservoir's capacity calculation, a technical observation based on a number she had checked herself. And Richard had fallen quiet for a second, looked at her with an expression she could not immediately catalogue, and said that she was entirely correct, and that there had been an error in his original estimate which he had not caught. It was not a compliment. It was merely an acknowledgement. But it was genuine, and she recognized its genuineness, and that felt different from a compliment in a way she could not quite explain at the time. She stated she had reviewed the figures, because that was what she did with any document affecting her interests. He replied that this was exactly what ought to be done. They sat in silence for a moment with the sound of the creek and the workers' tools clinking in the background. Then they resumed the meeting. But something had shifted in the air between them, very slightly, like when the wind changes direction just before the rain, too small to be called a transformation, large enough to be felt. It was around that same time that Marianne ran into Nelson Fields. But before Nelson, there was an afternoon, right in the middle of the dam's construction, that etched itself into Marianne with that precision of memory reserved for the unexpected. It was a Thursday in mid-April. The work had reached the point of installing the gates, the most delicate task of the entire structure. One of the workers had injured his wrist that morning, not severely, but enough to take him off duty. And the gate needed to be positioned by two people from a specific side of the dam, which happened to be the Good Hope side. Gideon had gone to fetch one of the spare hands when Richard, who was on the far side of the site monitoring the work, crossed the wooden divider separating the two halves of the construction and stated he could help out himself until the reinforcements arrived. Marianne was observing from the bench beneath the sycamore. She watched Richard and Gideon maneuver the gate together. With that coordination, two men, who understand physical labor, develop without needing many words. Richard knew exactly what he was doing. That much was obvious. There was something in the way he gripped the wooden frame, read the angle, and communicated through gesture rather than speech, which was the manner of someone who had labored with his own two hands instead of simply giving orders. She had not expected this. She had expected from a Sutton the type who stands with his arms crossed while the hired help does the sweating. Once the gate was positioned and secured, Gideon went to retrieve the mounting bolts. Richard stood at the edge of the dam, ankle-deep in bank mud inside his boots, staring at the structure to check if it was plumb. He turned his face toward Marianne almost by accident, that involuntary movement of someone checking to see if there was an observer, and she did not look away because there was no reason to look away. Richard said, across the distance separating them, that it was straight. Marianne replied that she had seen it too. Good placement. There was a very brief second in which the two stood looking at each other across the construction by the edge of the dam, the clamour of the workers in the background and the afternoon sun striking from the side. And then Gideon returned with the bolts, and the moment passed, but it lingered, the way certain moments linger without ever asking for permission. It was around that same time that Marianne ran into Nelson Fields. It was a Saturday at the St. Jude's Ridge Market, that small, bustling marketplace held every week in the town square, filled with stalls of fabrics and spices and farm goods that perfumed the air with that specific blend of a country fair. She was picking out beans when she heard someone call her name. She looked up and recognized him instantly, despite the 7 years that had gone by. Nelson Fields was 32 and looked different from the young man she remembered, broader in the shoulders, with less of that easy smile and more of a seriousness that stemmed not from natural maturity, but from someone carrying a burden. He said he was glad to see her back. He asked how she was doing. There was a delicacy in his voice she had not anticipated and did not quite know how to handle. She answered carefully that she was doing well, thank you, and had returned to manage the farm. And then she let the silence hang, because there was nothing else easy to say between them. Nelson said, using the voice of someone who had practiced his speech, but found it lacking in execution, that he had thought many times of finding her over the years to tell her something. That what had happened at that summer jubilee was an absolute stupidity he had been ashamed of from the very moment the words left his mouth. That the bet had been his idea, not Richard's, and that Richard had gone along with it without thinking, just as he himself had done without thinking, and that this did not make it right, but it was the truth. Marianne just stared at him. There was a great deal she could have said in that moment. She chose to say none of it. She simply stated that she was listening. Nelson continued. He said Richard hadn't even kept the wager money. That the very next morning he had sought her out to apologize and found she had already left. That afterward he had asked Nelson to pass along the message, but Nelson, armed with the cowardice of his 25 years back then, had failed to deliver it, and that he carried that weight with him. Marianne remained silent for a stretch of time that was much longer than it appeared on the outside. She held the beans in her hand, and she stared at the beans as if they were easier to process than what she had just heard. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me this." And she walked away. She walked back to Good Hope along the red dirt road with those fresh pieces of information organizing and reorganizing themselves inside her. The fact that the idea had been Nelson's, not Richard's. The fact that Richard had tried to apologize. The fact that Richard likely didn't remember the bet with any particular emphasis, because to him it had been a foolishness of youth he had tried to quickly rectify, whereas for her it had become a thorn that lodged deep. She had hated the version of Richard she had constructed over the last 7 years, a version that was part fact and part imagination. And now the imagination was giving way, and the facts were rearranging themselves into a different shape she needed time to see clearly. She walked back to Good Hope along the red dirt road with those fresh pieces of information organizing and reorganizing themselves inside her. The fact that the idea had been Nelson's, not Richard's. The fact that Richard had tried to apologize. The fact that Richard likely didn't remember the bet with any particular emphasis, because to him it had been a foolishness of youth he had tried to quickly rectify, whereas for her it had become a thorn that lodged deep. She had hated the version of Richard she had constructed over the last 7 years, a version that was part fact and part imagination. And now the imagination was giving way, and the facts were rearranging themselves into a different shape she needed time to see clearly. She arrived at Good Hope as the afternoon was already fading. Gideon was wrapping up the day's chores in the barn. She greeted him with that brief nod she used when her head was full and headed for the house. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time without lighting the stove, without preparing supper, simply sitting with her hands flat against the wooden table, surrounded by the silence of the house. Outside, the crickets began to chirp. The light turned a deeper purple, then fully dark. There was one specific thing that hurt, which she had never admitted to herself until that very moment. It was not just the fact of the bet. It was the fact that the sole moment she had let her guard down at that jubilee, the only moment she had allowed her interest to show without barring the door, had resulted in that. And she had taken it as absolute confirmation of what she was supposed to think. That opening up was dangerous, that whatever felt genuine usually was not, that it was infinitely safer to maintain the distance she kept. And now she discovers the story was far more complicated than that. That there had been an attempt at reparation, that there was regret, that there was a boy who had done a stupid thing and tried to fix it, and the fix had simply never arrived. This did not erase anything, but it changed the shape of what had occurred. And changing the shape changed the weight. She was not going to say anything, not yet. Perhaps never. But the information was there, doing its work on the inside, in that quiet but constant manner the truth has of straightening out the things that grew crooked. That night she wrote another letter to her mother. This time, she did not write a word about the farm. If you're enjoying this story, go ahead and leave a like before you continue. This helps the channel grow immensely and allows us to keep bringing you tales like this one. And if you have not subscribed yet, subscribe right now and ring the bell so you will not miss the upcoming stories heading your way. May arrived with a steadier sun and the Briar Creek Dam fully completed. The hired men headed back to Catawba, leaving behind a clean construction that operated exactly as designed. 2 separate water compartments divided by a central partition with adjustable sluice gates on either side, and the volume of the reservoir reflecting the sky whenever it was full, which in the spring's current state meant it was always below ideal but well above critical. On the morning the workers departed, Marianne walked down to the dam alone. She stood at the edge, staring at the water it had captured, listening to the silence that had replaced the clamor of construction, and for the first time since her return, she felt something that could cautiously be called hope. It was not a guarantee, it was a possibility, but after months of managing nothing but hardship, a possibility was everything. Richard showed up a few minutes later. She heard his approach by the crunch of footsteps on the bank, and she did not turn around. He stood beside her at a respectful distance and also watched the water for a moment. Then he said it had worked. His voice came out in a different tone than usual, lower, carrying something that might have been relief. Marianne replied that it had worked, and she added, without planning to add it, that it had been a very good idea. She gave credit where it was fair to give it, because that was what she did with absolutely everything. Richard turned his face to her for a split second, as if that praise had come from an angle he had not anticipated. Then he returned his gaze to the water. He said the credit belonged to them both, that without her he would not have approved the gate adjustment that ultimately improved the design. They stood in silence side by side, staring at the dam for a stretch of time longer than any of their previous silences. and neither of them sought to shorten it with idle chatter. It was a different silence from the ones they had shared before, less guarded. Then he said he needed to go, that he had work, and he left. She lingered a little while longer, then left as well, but the silence stayed with her for the remainder of the day, the way the good silences do. The monthly meetings to adjust the gates began in May. The first gathering was strictly technical, swift, with Gideon present representing Good Hope and a foreman from Fairview. By the second month, for a practical reason Marianne explained to herself as simply being more efficient, she went personally. Richard went personally too. They sat on the wooden bench beneath the sycamore tree and reviewed the numbers for the month. The reservoir level was stable, which was good. The flow from both gates was perfectly balanced, which was good. There was not much left to discuss technically. So they talked, not about important things at first, about the drought and how the other farmers in the region were coping, about the price of apples at the Catawba market, which had plummeted more than expected, about the condition of the roads after the latest meager rains that had arrived more as a faint memory than as actual weather. Marianne realized, in the middle of this conversation, that Richard knew far more about agricultural management than she had assumed. He spoke of soil, of crop rotation, of techniques he had learned not from his father, but from an agronomist he had hired 2 years prior on his own initiative. Because he had decided the way his father ran things desperately needed updating. She asked about this with genuine curiosity, the exact same curiosity she held for anything she could learn from. He noticed her curiosity. He answered with an openness she also had not expected. It was a full hour under that sycamore tree on that May afternoon, with the sound of the dam's water running in the background and the leaf shadows dancing on the dirt between them. And when Marianne returned to the Good Hope house in the late afternoon, she realized she had forgotten for an entire hour to keep her guard up. That was deeply unsettling. She went straight to her trunk, opened it, grabbed the paper, wrote. The letter to her mother stated she had spent an hour talking with Richard Sutton as if he were an ordinary person, and that he had behaved exactly like an ordinary person, which made everything vastly more complicated than it was back when she could simply hate him without having to examine why. Then she paused, stared at what she had written, and added that he had a way of listening that very few people possessed. The kind that stays genuinely quiet while you speak, rather than merely waiting for a turn to reply. And that this was, without a shadow of a doubt, terribly inconvenient. She folded the letter, tucked it away, went to sleep. In the days that followed, work took center stage. The pruning of the orchards was behind schedule, and Marianne had hired 2 extra hands with what was left of her tight budget. She worked right alongside them, something that had initially surprised everyone on the farm, which Gideon had accepted with the quiet resignation of someone who knows the boss lady is going to do whatever she decides to do anyway. She learned by doing, a conviction she had honed in the city that worked just as well in the soil. It was during one of these pruning days that Richard appeared in the Good Hope orchards. They hadn't arranged it. He hadn't sent word. He arrived on horseback via the side roads skirting the orchards, spotted Marianne amid the apple trees, holding pruning shears and wearing the straw hat that had belonged to her father, and he dismounted. He said he was crossing the property because a few calves had jumped the fence and wandered onto the boundary line, and that he had driven them back, but wanted to warn Gideon to check the fence on the eastern stretch. Then he stood watching the orchards for a moment and asked if the pruning was going well. Marianne said it was going, that she was learning. He fell silent for a moment. Then he said that if she wanted, he could send over a man from Fairview who knew a great deal about apple pruning to take a look. Not as a favor, he added quickly before she could answer. As a trade. She could pass on to his side the corrections she had made to the dam calculations. It was an intelligent way of offering help without placing her in a debtor's position. Marianne recognized this, and recognized that he had chosen that phrasing with the utmost care. She said she would think about it. Richard nodded. He climbed back onto his horse, and before riding off, he looked at her with a gaze she could not categorize quickly enough to defend herself against, and said that the hat suited her well. It was a work hat, plain woven straw. The comment came out with that specific lightness of someone stating a true thing without dressing it up. Marianne did not reply. She stood watching him leave, then looked at the orchard, then at the hat, and having no idea what to do with any of it, she simply went back to work. She did not write any letters that night. She sat on the porch, staring out into the dark for a while, and then went to bed earlier than usual, because by staying awake, her mind tended to wander into places she had not yet decided she wanted to visit. The pruning man Richard sent over was named Thomas, bearing no relation to the Sutton grandfather. He was a gentleman in his 50s who knew apple trees like few folks in the region. He spent 2 days in the Good Hope orchards, teaching Marianne and the hired hands the pruning techniques that made the difference between a healthy tree and one that produced half its yield. She learned with absolute focus, taking down notes where possible and memorizing what she could not write down. And by the end of those 2 days, she possessed a level of practical understanding that would have taken her months to acquire on her own. She sent a thank you note to Fairview, brief, objective, entirely unadorned. Richard's reply was equally brief. It stated Thomas had mentioned she was a fast learner, and that this came as no surprise. She read the note twice. Then she folded it and tucked it away with the letters in her trunk. She did not know why she did this until much later. June arrived with the characteristic chill of the Carolina hills, that dry cold that doesn't quite freeze but demands a thick coat and turns breakfast coffee into an absolute necessity rather than a mere habit. The farm was running smoother than it had in her father's last 2 years, not by miracle, but through months of accumulated labor and decisions Marianne had made with her head instead of her despair. The bank debt had a payment plan she could manage if the harvest was fair. The pruned orchards bore a different aspect, visibly healthier. The monthly meetings at the dam continued. July, August. Summer was approaching, and the spring was recovering a bit of the volume the drought had stolen. Still below ideal, but noticeably better than the month prior. And the conversations beneath the sycamore tree kept growing, not in any planned way. They grew the way things without declared intentions grow, a little bit at a time, with that naturalness that seems inevitable when you look back, but felt anything but inevitable while it was happening. One subject led to another. A question opened up a story. An observation met an answer that was longer than necessary because there was something else being spoken underneath. The monthly meetings at the dam continued. July, August. Summer was approaching, and the spring was recovering a bit of the volume the drought had stolen, still below ideal, but noticeably better than the month prior. And the conversations beneath the sycamore tree kept growing, not in any planned way. They grew the way things without declared intentions grow, a little bit at a time, with that naturalness that seems inevitable when you look back, but felt anything but inevitable while it was happening. One subject led to another. A question opened up a story. An observation met an answer that was longer than necessary because there was something else being spoken underneath. In July, on a brisk Carolina afternoon, with a crisp sky and cold air that possessed that specific quality which sharpens everything around, Marianne had mentioned in passing that she had studied the pruning techniques Thomas had taught her and had read about them in an agricultural bulletin she had ordered by mail from Raleigh. Richard had gone quiet for a second, wearing that expression of someone processing an unexpected piece of information. Then he had asked where she had found that publication. She told him the name, a limited circulation technical journal that reached the cities but rarely the countryside. She had subscribed while living in Raleigh upon the recommendation of a studio client who was an agricultural engineer. Richard replied that he had tried to subscribe to that exact same journal 2 years ago, and the mail had somehow gotten lost. He had simply given up. She said she could pass along the issues she had found most useful for the type of apples grown in the region. He looked at her for a second. Then he stated he would gladly take them. That exchange resulted in an afternoon where she arrived at the meeting with her own notes from the articles, and he arrived with questions, proving he had read up on something similar through other means. And they spent over 2 hours debating cultivation techniques, with Briar Creek rushing in the background and the sun dipping behind the hill. And neither of them noticed the time passing until the light finally changed. In August, at a meeting that had started out strictly technical and blossomed into a conversation without either of them deciding on it, Richard had spoken about his father. He hadn't said much. He merely stated that Edward Sutton was a man who had built everything he possessed entirely on his own, and had never learned to trust anyone's judgment, not even his own son's, that this had been incredibly hard when he was young, and that it had stopped being hard once he understood his father's distrust was not actually about him. Marianne had listened in silence. And then, because it felt right to match what had been offered, she shared that her father was the exact opposite. That Joseph Cordell trusted too much and verified too little, which had been a wonderful environment to grow up in, but terrible for business. And that she had inherited the trust, but taught herself to verify. Richard noted that it was a good combination. She replied that sometimes it worked. They stared at the dam water for a moment. There was a long-legged heron standing at the water's edge with the absolute stillness of a creature that has completely mastered the art of waiting. Richard said he had noticed something about her from the very beginning, that she never asked for help, but she also never turned it down when it was offered in a practical way. He added that he found that highly intelligent. Marianne replied that she did not think it was intelligence. It was simply that asking cost her pride, while refusing cost her resources, and on the scales she preferred to pay with her pride. He laughed. It was a small thing, a short chuckle that escaped as if entirely unplanned, and which hung in the air for a second before he returned to his usual serious demeanor. It was the first time she heard him laugh, and she logged it, because it was the type of thing she logged without ever deciding to do so. The heron caught something. It bent its neck, tipped its beak upward, and swallowed. Then it stood motionless once more, wielding that patience of one who knows the water will bring exactly what is needed if you just hold the right position. Marianne watched the heron for a moment. There was something about that animal standing still by the water's edge that she could not name, but that stayed with her. The image of something that does not rush, that does not force anything, that trusts a process it cannot control. Richard was looking at the heron too. He stated, with that low tone reserved for observations that slip out unplanned, that there had been one of those in that exact same spot every day for weeks. That the workers during the dam's construction had tried to scare it away multiple times, and it had simply flown off, circled around, and returned to the very same spot. Marianne said the heron had better sense than the men trying to scare it off. Richard looked at her sideways. There was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth that was nothing like the short, unplanned laugh from earlier. This was different, quieter, the smile of someone feeling perfectly at ease exactly where he is, and knowing it full well. He said she was right, and neither of them spoke another word for an amount of time that was more than enough. He stood up, and when she left, she felt his gaze tracking her footsteps up the embankment until she vanished around the bend of the trail, even without turning back to confirm it. She knew it was so. She just didn't know what to do with it. Edward Sutton made his first appearance in their conversations in September. Richard had arrived at the monthly meeting 10 minutes late, which had never happened before. Marianne noticed a difference in him the moment he arrived, carrying that specific tension of someone who has just had a difficult conversation and is trying to leave it outside the room. They went over the numbers. Everything was well within expectations. The dam had performed excellently during the driest months, and the spring was beginning to recover with September's early rains. There was very little to decide on a technical level. As they were wrapping up, Marianne asked him point-blank if there was a problem, not out of obligation, out of something simpler she did not care to examine. Richard fell silent for a second. Then he explained that his father had mentioned he wanted a meeting with her to discuss the boundary line between the properties, that there was a section of the dividing line which had been the subject of an old dispute, and Edward believed it should be formally resolved. Marianne felt her jaw set. She asked what Richard thought about this. He looked at her with a frankness she had learned over these past months to recognize as absolutely genuine. He stated he thought the boundary was working perfectly fine as it was, and that bringing up a formal dispute over it at this time served his father's interests in maintaining the distance between the families far more than any practical interest of the farm itself. She stood looking at him. It was the first time he had openly said something that placed his point of view in direct contradiction with his father's. She told him that if Edward Sutton wished to meet with her, she was available to listen, but he should come bearing documents, not old tales. Richard nodded. There was a mild relief in his expression, which she noticed but did not mention. Edward Sutton showed up at Good Hope on a September afternoon, carrying an umbrella when it was not raining, wearing a seriousness that attempted to pass for authority. He was a man in his early 60s, possessing the stature and presence of someone who had spent decades being the most important farmer in the county and had built a considerable part of his identity upon that very importance. Marianne received him on the porch with the customary coffee and absolutely no flourish. She listened to what he had to say regarding the boundary line with full attention and without a single interruption. Edward's argument was that there was a 130-foot stretch of the eastern border that had not been clearly demarcated in the original deed, and he believed it should be settled in Fairview's favor. She fetched the documents she had meticulously reviewed since returning to the farm. She placed them on the table between them. She pointed to the exact spot Edward was describing. She highlighted the marking present in the original deed, which was perfectly clear to anyone who knew how to read the bureaucratic registry language of the era. And she stated in a calm voice that there was no ambiguity whatsoever in the document, and she had no interest in renegotiating an established boundary. Edward stared at her for a moment. That look contained an evaluation that was not friendly, but neither was it completely hostile. It was the look of a man seeing someone he had deeply underestimated and who is now actively adjusting his estimations. He said she looked very much like her mother. He delivered this like someone handing over a piece of information, without elaborating further. Marianne asked if he had known her mother. Edward replied that he had. That Letitia Cordell was a sharp-minded woman who never let anyone walk away without saying exactly what needed to be said. They sat in silence for a moment. Edward grabbed his umbrella, stood up, and stated he would think over what she had presented. He had not conceded, but he had not pressed the issue either. It was the absolute maximum retreat a man of his sort was capable of offering all at once. She watched him leave down the red dirt road and lingered on the porch, thinking about what he had said regarding Letitia, and about the fact that Edward Sutton, beneath it all, was a man who carried ancient burdens just like everyone else, and that there were some of those burdens she would probably never fully understand. That night she wrote to her mother. She wrote that she had met with Edward Sutton and that he had said she was just like her, Letitia, and that she didn't know if this was a compliment or merely an observation, but either way, she had kept it. Richard showed up early the very next day, well ahead of the monthly October meeting that wasn't scheduled until later in the week. He said he knew his father had come to see her. He explained he had not known of the visit beforehand, otherwise he would have sent a warning. And he added, with that directness that felt increasingly familiar, that he hoped it had not been difficult. Marianne replied that it had been manageable, and then, because there was something she desperately needed to know, she asked what had truly happened between their two fathers, beyond the tale of the soured business deal. Richard stayed quiet for a moment. Then he sat on the edge of the porch, which was a gesture completely different from all his previous ones, far more informal, like someone deciding not to stay standing for a conversation that is about to be painfully honest. He explained that he had discovered, not too many years ago, that the feud between Joseph Cordell and Thomas Sutton possessed a second layer that was never spoken out loud in either family. That long before the apple business, the two men had been truly close, friends since their youth, and that the falling out had destroyed not just a commercial partnership, but a friendship that had lasted for years. That his father, Edward, had grown up watching his own father carry that like an unhealed wound, and had learned to harbour it as well, without ever fully knowing why. Marianne listened in total silence. Richard said he wasn't sharing this to justify anything, but he felt she had the absolute right to know that what lay between their families was far more complicated than a simple rivalry. And that complicated did not necessarily mean unfixable. He stayed completely still after saying this, staring out at the orchard hill, catching the morning sun, bathed in that golden hue healthy apple trees take on when they are well tended. Marianne looked out at the exact same hill for a moment. Then she remarked that she believed the stories families pass down are very much like hand-me-down clothes. You wear them for years without ever questioning if they actually fit, and when you finally try to take them off, you sometimes discover you've grown much larger than they ever were. Richard turned his face to her. There was something different in the way he looked at her. It was not admiration, which would be easy enough to catalogue and discard. It was something quieter. The gaze of a man seeing someone from an angle he had never once viewed before. He said that was a very good way to put it. She replied that it was just what she had noticed, and the silence that followed was easily the most comfortable one they had shared up until that point. It was in October that Nelson Fields found his way back into the story. There was a harvest party at the home of a farmer named Amos Taylor, a generous man who celebrated the harvest every single year, regardless of how the actual yield had been, living by the practical philosophy that giving thanks for what arrived was far more productive than complaining about what didn't. The entire region was invited. Marianne attended simply because Mrs. Pearl had insisted with that affectionate persistence which was entirely impossible to fully refuse. Folks from all over the county were at Amos's farm, long tables laid out beneath the pecan trees, and a fiddle playing in the corner with the musician who had eventually replaced the old blind fiddler. Marianne ran into Mrs. Pearl right at the entrance, which was a massive relief, because her company made absolutely any environment infinitely more navigable. Richard was there too. She spotted him from afar, chatting with a few men near the tables, and she felt that very thing she had learned over the passing months to identify, but still hadn't found a proper name for, a kind of heightened awareness of his presence that flared up before she had even consciously decided to pay attention. Nelson Fields appeared by her side during a moment when Mrs. Pearl had stepped away to greet an acquaintance. He approached with that exact same seriousness she had noticed at the market and stated he had spoken with Richard. Marianne asked him what he had said. Nelson replied that he had told him about running into her at the market back in March. He hadn't gone into detail about what exactly he had said, but Richard had pressed him, and Nelson had finally admitted he had apologized for what transpired at the Jubilee in 1924. She stayed dead quiet, waiting for the rest. Nelson said Richard had fallen completely silent for a good while, And then he had demanded to know exactly what Nelson had told her. And when Nelson finally confessed it, Richard's face had taken on that precise expression Nelson had known since childhood, the one he wore when he was processing something that affected him far more than he was willing to show. He said that, and then he walked away from her, leaving what he had spoken to properly settle. Marianne stood rooted in the middle of the party, with these new pieces of information piling onto the previous ones, forming a picture she had never once foreseen when she stepped off that train in March with a battered leather suitcase and the sole determination to fix up the farm and absolutely nothing else. She felt him approaching before she even saw him. It was that awareness she had long stopped trying to suppress, because suppressing it simply did not work. He stopped by her side, not too close but well within conversation range. There was something remarkably different in his posture, an openness that was not his habit. He stated, without looking directly at her at first, that Nelson had spoken with him, and that he had finally understood he needed to say something he had tried to say 7 years ago and which had been left entirely unspoken. Marianne waited. Richard turned his face toward her. He said that what had happened at that summer jubilee in 1924 had been an outright stupidity he had been deeply ashamed of by the very next morning, that he had gone looking for her to apologize and she had already left, and that afterward he had asked Nelson to pass along the message and Nelson had failed to do so. He said he had no good excuse for what he had done, but that he wanted her to know he had at least tried. The party raged on around them, the fiddle playing, the chatter mixing into the night air, the pecan trees strung with the colored glass lanterns Amos hung up every single year. Marianne stared at him for a very long moment. 7 years of carrying a thorn, and now this, she told him she knew, that Nelson had told her at the market, and that it had taken her some time to process, but that she finally understood. Richard went entirely still. In that silence there was something she easily recognized as relief, and something else she could not find a name for quite fast enough. She said one more thing. She said she had held onto that for a very long time in a way that had done her no good whatsoever, and that holding onto it had changed absolutely nothing about what had happened. It had merely weighed far more than it ever needed to, and that she was officially deciding to let that weight go. It was not full forgiveness in the shape of a grand speech. It was far more honest than that. It was a woman stating exactly what she was truly doing, not just what sounded pretty to say. Richard said thank you in a voice distinctly different from his previous ones, quieter, holding something inside it that was genuine in a way that required zero ornament. They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, engulfed by the party around them. Then Mrs. Pearl materialized with 2 plates of food, one for each of them, wearing that expression of someone pretending to see nothing special while actually seeing everything, and declared it an absolute crime to let Amos's cooking go cold. They both accepted the plates, and they remained, entirely without planning it, on the exact same side of the party for the rest of the night. What happened next did not happen all at once. It happened the way true things happen, slowly, without grand announcements, possessing that quality of inevitability that only becomes entirely clear when you look back. November arrived with the first good rains of the year, those afternoon showers that bring the scent of wet earth, which is one of the greatest smells in existence, and the source of Briar Creek finally began to recover its volume in a meaningful way. The dam functioned perfectly. The gates functioned. The agreement between the 2 farms functioned, and the monthly meetings beneath the sycamore tree had steadily transformed into something quite different from what they had started out as. There was no specific moment where this was openly declared. It was more a series of tiny things piling up, the way the technical meetings ended quickly, yet the conversations dragged on. The way he listened to her when she spoke about the farm, or about Raleigh, or about what she had learned from Connie regarding managing her own business. The way she had begun asking questions that weren't strictly necessary for practical matters, simply because she genuinely wanted to know the answers. If you have made it this far into the story, we know you can feel exactly what is unfolding between them. Leave a like if this tale is warming your heart. It makes all the difference in helping the channel continue bringing stories just like this one. On a November afternoon, with the recent rains turning the red clay a deeper shade and the scent of fresh greenery hanging in the air, Marianne was pruning a stretch of the orchards nearest the eastern boundary when she heard the hooves of Richard's horse on the parallel trail. He dismounted without being summoned and stood staring at the apple trees for a moment. He said they were looking incredibly well. He said it like someone who actually understands what he is looking at, not just making idle chatter. She replied that they were, that the Thomas he had sent over had made a world of difference. Richard stood looking at her amid the apple trees, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows between the trunks, and he said something that slipped out in a tone completely different from his usual one. He said he had genuinely enjoyed getting to know her, not the inherited role, not Marianne Cordell of the rival farm, her, and that he had discovered over the course of these past months that the version he had grown up hearing about the Cordells had very little to do with who she truly was. Marianne lowered her pruning shears. She just stared at him. There was something about that moment that was entirely different from all the others, not because of the information, but because of the delivery. Richard was not being eloquent. He was being honest, wielding that kind of honesty that costs a great deal because it exposes a person, and which is far rarer than it ever ought to be. She told him she had thought the exact same thing regarding the Suttons, that the version she had grown up hearing was absolutely not him. Richard went quiet. Then he took a step in her direction, a small one, but infinitely larger than any previous step he had taken. He stated he wanted to be honest about one more thing, that he had initiated that first conversation about the dam with the strictly practical goal of solving the water issue, and that at some point along the passing months he had realized he was showing up to these meetings for reasons that no longer had anything practical about them whatsoever. The orchard was dead silent around them. A breeze rustled the apple leaves. Far off, a bird sang 3 distinct notes, and then stopped. Marianne stood looking at him for a very long second. Then she told him she knew. She said it in that low, direct voice that was entirely her way whenever a subject was truly serious. Richard asked her what she thought about that. She looked at the apple trees, at the sky turning a deep orange on the horizon, and then she looked right back at him. She said she had arrived from Raleigh absolutely determined to fix up the farm and head right back, that there had been no room in that plan for anything beyond that. And that plans, she was discovering right now, possessed an incredibly inconvenient habit of failing to consult a person's heart before they went ahead and changed. Richard stood frozen. And then, slowly, that smile she had first witnessed beneath the sycamore tree appeared on his face, that short, unplanned laugh that slipped out when something caught him from an angle he hadn't prepared for. Only this time it wasn't a laugh. It was something much quieter, much firmer. He held his hand out to her, not for a handshake, just to be there, palm open, an offer that demanded zero immediate reply. Marianne looked at that open hand for a moment. Then she placed her own inside it. The leaves of the apple trees danced once more in the breeze. The sun dipped a fraction lower on the horizon, glowing a deep red over the hills of St. Jude's Ridge. That night, Marianne wrote the longest letter she had ever written to her mother since beginning the habit. She recounted absolutely everything, every little detail, every perception, every fleeting moment she had logged without even knowing what she was logging at the time. She wrote about the open hand in the orchard and exactly what she had felt when she placed hers inside it. And at the very end she wrote, "I truly think you would have liked him, Mother. Not in the way people like someone when they're merely trying to be polite, but the way a person likes someone who is entirely real." She folded the letter. She did not tuck it away in the trunk with the rest. She left it sitting out on the table for that one night, almost as if it needed to breathe. The month of December brought the good rains and the exact harvest Marianne had toiled so hard to achieve. It was not the bounty Good Hope had seen in its finest years, but it was more than enough to pay off the bank and have some left over. It was the very beginning of something that held a real future. Edward Sutton had revisited the boundary issue a second time, back in November, and that time he had brought along a lawyer. Marianne had brought her documents and answered his lawyer in his exact same language with utter calm and precision, and the lawyer had examined the paperwork and quietly informed Edward that Good Hope's position was ironclad. Edward had departed without saying much of anything. The very next afternoon, Richard had shown up at Good Hope. He stated his father had officially decided not to press the boundary issue any further. He delivered the news without celebration, but there was a distinct relief woven into his voice. Marianne thanked him, and then she asked, because there was something she desperately wanted to know, what Edward thought about the developing situation between the two of them. Richard stayed quiet for a moment. Then he admitted his father knew, that he had not approved of it initially. That he had claimed the Cordells were of a stock the Suttons had absolutely no business mixing with, but that he had also watched, over the passing months, what had occurred on the Good Hope property, the undeniable way Marianne had turned the situation completely around, and that Edward Sutton, underneath all that heavy armor, fundamentally respected competence the second he saw it. And that respect, in his father's rigid vocabulary, was the absolute most anyone could ever hope for as a starting point. Marianne stated that a starting point was fine by her. Richard agreed that it was, and he looked at her in a way that required zero further words. December arrived in full force. Good Hope had sufficient water, a thoroughly reasonable harvest, and a future that once again seemed entirely possible. Marianne had written to Connie and Raleigh, recounting briefly what had transpired, leaving out the intimate details that still belonged only to her. Connie had written back with that expansive joy, which was her absolute trademark, declaring she had known from the very start that Marianne was going to figure it all out, and adding that the studio was doing wonderfully, but that there was always a spare chair waiting for her if she ever needed it. Marianne had written back that she was going to need time, that there were things down here that were still in the midst of being built, and it was the absolute truth. There were things being built which she had never once planned for, and which, she was discovering right now, were easily the most important things of all. There existed between her and Richard a complicity that had grown incredibly slowly, and was now deeply woven into every single detail of their interactions. In the way he arrived at their meetings, and she simply knew he was there long before she ever heard the horse. In the way she spoke, and he listened with that total attention she had learned to recognize as profoundly rare. In the moments when the two of them stood staring out at the exact same horizon, and the silence between them felt infinitely richer than the vast majority of conversations she had ever had in her life. There were also the moments that were not silent at all. An afternoon when he had shown up at Good Hope holding an accounting issue, he asked her to look over, not because he couldn't solve it himself, but solely because he wanted to know exactly what she thought. And she had realized this, and had answered him fully knowing that she had realized it, and the two of them had simply sat there with the papers scattered on the table, sharing that highly specific lightness of someone who is sitting beside a person with whom they can be entirely whole. A morning when she was reviewing the farm ledgers at the parlor table, and he had turned up unannounced, something that had long ceased to feel like an invasion and had simply become him, and he had stayed right there for 2 solid hours, helping her untangle a surveying issue she was trying to puzzle out. And when that topic was exhausted, he had stayed anyway because there were other topics to cover, and she had let him stay because she had other topics of her own. And there was the afternoon when they were walking the eastern boundary to check a fence line that required patching. The two of them side by side on the narrow trail wedged between the apple trees and the woods, and the sun was striking sideways during that exact hour photographers refer to as golden. And Richard had muttered something that hadn't been entirely clear due to a bird calling out at that precise second, and she had asked him to repeat it, and he had turned to face her with that sideways sun hitting him, and had repeated that he genuinely believed he had never liked any place quite as much as he liked being right here. She had completely understood that here was not a physical place at all. She had stared at him for a quiet second. Then she had told him she knew exactly how that felt. He had smiled, not the brief, unplanned chuckle from before. A smile that was vastly more open, far more present, one that transformed his entire face. She had thought to herself that it was easily the most beautiful smile she had seen in a very long time. She had thought this, and she had not made the slightest attempt not to think it. This final piece of the story, allow me to tell it with the absolute delicacy it deserves. Before that, if you have made it this far, let us just say one thing: thank you for staying. Every single person who watches until the very end is someone who inherently understands that good stories require time to unfold completely. Share this video with anyone you believe will love this tale, because stories of true love absolutely deserve to be spread. Richard asked Marianne to marry him on a March night in 1932, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off that train with her battered leather suitcase and the fierce determination to fix the farm and do nothing else. It was not an elaborate proposal. There were no flowers and 0 prepared speeches. It happened beneath the sycamore tree, right at the edge of the dam they had built with their own hands, with Briar Creek rushing stronger than it had in years because the summer rains had been wildly generous. The moon was entirely full over the hills of St. Jude's Ridge, casting a glow upon the water that was simply the most beautiful and uncomplicated thing she had ever witnessed in that place. Richard confessed he had thought long and hard about the proper way to do this, and had finally reached the conclusion that the proper way was simply the honest way. He stated that she had walked into his life through the door of strict necessity, but she had remained there through the door of absolute choice. That he had learned more from her in a single year than he had learned in countless years prior, and not regarding farming or accounting or irrigation, but rather how to exist in the world in a way that truly mattered, and that he desperately wanted to keep learning if she would let him. Marianne stood staring at the water behind the dam for a long moment, at the moon's reflection shimmering on the surface, at the 2 wooden sluice gates resting open at the exact right measure, painstakingly regulated every single month, supplying each side with precisely what each side required. Then she turned to look at him, and she said yes. Edward Sutton found out the very next day. His immediate reaction was a heavy, drawn-out silence that Richard described to Marianne with that exact precision he possessed for difficult subjects. The kind of silence that isn't a refusal, but rather a man desperately needing time for something ancient to yield space for something entirely new. 3 days later, Edward showed up at Good Hope, all alone. He asked to speak directly with Marianne. She received him on the porch with the usual cup of coffee. Edward admitted he'd been wrong about a few things over the years. He did not list which ones, because he was simply not the kind of man who made lists. But he said it, and he added that Marianne was Letitia Cordell's daughter, and that any woman who was Letitia's daughter possessed the exact right measure. Marianne listened closely, and she replied, using that tranquil voice that belonged solely to her, that she had heard tales from her father regarding the Suttons that would also desperately need some revising. that she firmly believed the two of them shared something in common right there, and that perhaps it would be a very good place for them to start. Edward stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that deeply surprised them both. He smiled. A tiny, incredibly brief smile, but entirely real. And he conceded that perhaps it was. Mrs. Pearl, the moment she heard of the engagement, had only one single thing to say. She proclaimed she had known since that very first morning she showed up carrying the bean stew, that absolutely anyone with working eyes could clearly see what was happening long before the two of them ever caught on, and that it had taken far more time than was strictly necessary, but that it had finally reached its proper conclusion. Marianne laughed out loud, and she hugged the old woman with the kind of embrace you reserve for the people who were truly there exactly when you needed them. The wedding took place in June of 1932, in a modest ceremony at the little church in St. Jude's Ridge, officiated by the new reverend, who was already well acquainted with the history of the two families and who conducted the service with the exact solemnity the moment demanded. Mrs. Pearl sat dead center in the front row, her eyes shining brightly. Edward Sutton stood right beside his son, holding his usual stiff posture, but harboring something entirely different on the inside that only those paying close attention could possibly spot. Gideon, Good Hope's foreman, wore a borrowed suit, his thick moustache neatly trimmed specifically for the grand occasion. Nelson Fields was there too. He had arrived early and tracked Marianne down before the ceremony, explicitly telling her he was happy, truly happy. And she had replied that she knew he was, because he too had played a part in this in a way he perhaps did not entirely understand. And Nelson's eyes had grown a little damp, the undeniable eyes of someone finally watching an ancient guilt wash away. Marianne wore a dress she had sewn entirely by herself, fashioned from white linen featuring hand embroidery that had taken her 3 full weeks to finish. Every single stitch placed with that meticulous attention she reserved solely for the things that truly mattered. It was incredibly simple and entirely perfect, which was exactly what she wanted it to be. When the Reverend asked the question, and she firmly answered yes, Richard possessed eyes that completely failed to hide exactly what lived inside them. And she looked deep into those eyes and knew, armed with that rare certainty, completely unlike any other, that she had finally arrived exactly where she was heading. The little church bell rang out over St. Jude's Ridge, and the joyous echo travelled across the hills, blanketed in green orchards, reaching all the way down to the Briar Creek Dam, where the gates sat open at their perfect measure on that warm June morning, allowing the water to rush toward both sides with all the generosity the newly recovered spring could possibly offer. The years that followed were years of pure building, not an absence of hardship, because hardship absolutely refuses to respect either marriage or good intentions. But it was hardship faced together by two people who had thoroughly learned, long before choosing one another, that the other was precisely the type of person who does not walk away the second things get difficult. Good Hope and Fairview kept steadily growing, each retaining its own identity, yet functioning with a cooperation that had become as entirely natural as breathing. Marianne brought to the management of the farms the crisp clarity she had honed in the city combined with the raw knowledge she had pulled from the dirt. And Richard supplied the deep intimacy with the soil and the profound patience the earth's cycles rigidly demand. They were simply better together in ways neither of them had ever been good alone, which is easily the greatest definition of partnership in existence. The Briar Creek Dam was expanded in 1935, when the heavy rains returned with a vengeance, and the spring recovered more than enough volume to fully justify the investment. The larger construction was planned entirely by the two of them, sitting together at the exact same porch table at Good Hope, where they had sat that very first time, using documents as a literal trench between them. This time, The table held hot coffee for 2 and 0 trenches. Edward Sutton kept steadily yielding over the passing years with that specific sluggishness of those raised impossibly stiff, who discover far too late that stiffness carries an agonizing price. He was never effusive. It simply wasn't his nature, but he grew present in a way that signaled absolute, genuine respect. There was one specific memory Marianne locked away from those early years of marriage, with that shocking sharpness the simplest things occasionally possess. On a Sunday afternoon, Edward had come over and was sitting on the porch with her and Richard as the sun began to sink. The three of them had sat in silence for a while, staring out at the orchard hill caught in the late afternoon glow. Edward had stated without looking at either of them that the land was looking incredibly well. There was something in his voice that was vastly more than a mere observation about apple trees, and Richard had quietly replied that it was. And there was something inside that incredibly brief exchange that felt entirely like peace, which Marianne recognized immediately as peace, and which was more than enough for her to finally understand that some reconciliations do not require grand speeches. They merely require time and exceptionally quiet days, exactly like that one. Mrs. Pearl remained a constant, immovable fixture in their lives, wielding the absolute fidelity of people who choose exactly who they love with extreme care and then stay planted right there forever. She showed up without fail early in the morning, consistently bearing something warm in a pot, always sporting those honey eyes that saw entirely too much and that never once lost that specific spark of someone who truly enjoys watching the world, even after decades of active observation. On an afternoon in 1938, still sitting on the porch beside Marianne, just as she had from the very beginning, Mrs. Pearl remarked that she had watched a great deal of marriages over her long lifetime, that she had witnessed the ones that started out with grand parties and ended entirely in bitterness, and the ones that started out steeped in hardship and only grew sweeter with the passing years, which were easily the rarest and the most beautiful ones to behold. She had said this staring directly at the orchards, without naming a single soul, which was her absolute perfect way of saying exactly what she wanted to say, without ever needing to explain a single word of it. Marianne had quickly replied that she knew exactly which of the two hers was. Mrs. Pearl had nodded firmly and gone right back to her stew. Nelson Fields moved away to another town a few years later, but he drifted back sometimes, and whenever he returned, he always showed up at Good Hope, carrying that manner of someone who knows full well he is welcome, but still shoulders a tiny bit of the weight of having been part of a story that could have easily gone completely wrong. Marianne welcomed him every single time. Not because she had forgotten a thing, but because she had firmly decided that certain stories managed to end up in a much better place than where they began, and that fact absolutely deserved to be recognized. And the Briar Creek Dam kept functioning for many, many long years exactly as it had been built to function. Two distinct sides, one shared body of water, the sluice gates painstakingly regulated every single time the shifting seasons demanded it. A strictly practical structure born entirely out of raw necessity that had quietly become, without a single soul ever planning it, the absolute perfect symbol of what the two of them had painstakingly built together. Nothing that divides has to divide forever. Sometimes the exact thing that separates is precisely the thing that unites, provided both sides possess the raw courage to look at it in an entirely new way. Marianne Cordell and Richard Sutton took one whole year of inherited hatred, 3 solid months of sheer practical resistance, and 7 slow months of gradual surrender to arrive exactly where they did. And when they finally arrived, they arrived to stay for good, armed with the undeniable solidity of things that were violently tested long before they were ever chosen. In St. Jude's Ridge. The locals still frequently tell the tale of the two proud families who fiercely hated each other, but the ending has entirely changed. The ending turned out vastly different from anything anyone had ever predicted back when the rivalry was at its absolute peak, back when the names Cordell and Sutton were spoken in the same breath purely as a warning. Now they are spoken together in an entirely different way, as a promise. And out there in the rolling hills, blanketed by green apple orchards, when Briar Creek runs full and heavy during the good seasons and the dam's gates rest open at their absolute exact measure, you can still easily hear, if you just pay attention to that incredibly specific country, silence completely filled with sounds for anyone who truly knows how to listen. The steady rush of water that knows absolutely nothing of hatred, that only knows how to flow toward wherever it desperately needs to reach, pulling along with it absolutely everything it encounters along the way.